Yeah. Right. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Kiran, your host for this particular webinar series, Impact Lecture Series of IIC. Right. Today we have Mr. Arun Tanksali, who would be talking on a title topic of building successful startups. I would just like to introduce Mr. Arun Tanksali with his brief resume. Currently, Mr. Arun is co-founder and CTO with Nearex. Former, he was working with Mahindra Comviva as CTO during June 2012 to June 2030. Next, prior to that, he was working with Comviva Technologies as VP for mobile device solutions and lifestyle solutions. Prior to that, he was with CTO Software nearly for 9 years, 1 month as CTO. Right. Also worked as director for Jatayu Software. He also worked as project manager for Integra Microsystems. He also worked with microprocessor application engineering program as an engineer. Coming to his education, he holds a bachelor's degree in engineering in electronics and communication and ME from College of Engineering, Electronics and Telecommunication. Mr. Arun, I wholeheartedly welcome you for this webinar series on building successful startups. I welcome you on behalf of our management principals, faculties, coordinators, as well as non-teaching staff. Over to you, Mr. Arun. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are very much audible.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Kiran. It's a pleasure to be here. Also like to thank Dr. Vinay and the faculty and the principal of PESCE for having invited me to this talk. I understand that you are having a series of sessions on from our innovation. I think that's a wonderful opportunity for all the students, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this initiative from your institution. I've had the pleasure of being associated with PESCE in the recent times. In my IEEE role, as part of IEEE TEMS Bangalore, I have been working on a project called the Young Engineers Entrepreneurship Program. And I'm glad to say that there are 3 teams from Mandya, PS Mandya, who have been participating in this. And I recently had an occasion to visit your institution, and it was a wonderful interaction that I had with the students and the teams there. So thank you for inviting me again to be a part of this particular initiative. So today, I'm going to be talking about building successful startups, though you will know in a couple of slides that that's a bit of a misnomer, and you'll understand why. So the way I would like to begin is to understand what exactly is your, from the student's point of view, what do they mean by successful, right? Successful can mean a very wide variety of things, right? So is it the unicorn status that a lot of the new startups are going through, I think the 20 plus this year, plus a few more in the previous years. So is that the one? Is there something else? So what constitutes success? If we are not able to clearly articulate what success means for ourselves, then how do we build a startup that is successful? So I think it's important for us to understand what success means. So anybody wants to take a stab? I know it's a little bit of a tricky one to get interaction going because of the hybrid model of doing things. But if there's any opportunity for you to respond, it would be great to get your responses either on voice or on chat. I'm not sure which one will work better. So if there are any volunteers to talk about what success means for them, the startup world, it would be great to hear. All right, so let me go ahead. So to me personally, right, since I have the mic and I can talk about that, it's the joy of seeing a product or a service that you have built getting used and liked by your users. I think that's, to me, the biggest success that one can get as an engineer. The joy of seeing your creation getting actually used and someone really wanting to use it and liking it. So that's my definition of what success means. And, so that's sort of what I'll go with for the rest of the session. So it doesn't mean that you should keep financial success or other measures of success out. It's just that each of us may have a very specific personal definition of success, and that's something which you need to be aware of. But before we start seeing how the startups become successful and how you can make a startup that you would potentially create successful, we need to understand that there is really no single formula for making a successful startup. And you can create startups which are successful. You can create startups which go on to have moderate success or brilliant success, but none of them will actually follow the exact same blueprint. So I don't personally find a talk on or a book, for example, on how to create a successful startup very effective. In an open-ended area like entrepreneurship, having a book like or a talk like How to Succeed kind of implies that there's just one single path to that end goal, and I don't think that's really true. There are hundreds of different paths. Each of us can choose a different one. The success of Zomato isn't the same as SpaceX, for example. So they follow different paths. And hence, I think a more effective title would have been really How to Avoid Pitfalls. How to succeed at entrepreneurship is kind of equivalent. If you none of you, at least the students wouldn't be, but at least the faculty can appreciate that it's trying to come up with a talk or books in how to be a good parent, right? All you can do is get advice on how not to be a lousy one, but there is really no single magic formula which says how to be a good parent. So it's very similar in the startup world. So what I'm going to be talking about here is the things which are best done and what are best practices that you can potentially follow and help increase the chances of your success. So it might sound a little underwhelming, but I think that's a more rational way to start looking at this particular domain. So there are various ways of looking at this, and there are maybe dozens of different models, exactly like dozens or maybe hundreds of different ways to succeed. All startups start with, in some sense, the idea that you're trying to realize, and then it goes through a cycle, and eventually you hopefully would have the success that you have defined for yourself. It's a cycle, and we will go through some of these blocks. I need to confess one thing. In most of the time when I talk to on successful startups or how to make startups succeed, it is with people who are in startups, who are already started a company or something like that. It's one of the few times that I'm talking to students, and hence I may be a little bit at a loss on what would be the most relevant things, and I hope to learn, through the interaction on what would be the most relevant things for you while we go through this as well. But given that the most of you, or maybe all of you, haven't really got a startup going at this time, I would focus more on the initial few stages rather than on the last few things of scaling and funding, because that's where I believe most of the activities that you would need to perform would lie. So that kind of gives you a context on where I am coming from. So let me see if... right. So how do you get an idea? When we ran this Young Engineers Entrepreneurship Program sometime in March and April, we had a call for applications from students. And we interacted with about 300 different students across maybe about 15 different colleges. Right? And one of the things which came back most strongly, and I don't know if it is relevant to each of you, but at least based on our interaction and experience, that seems to be an important question. Where do we get ideas from? How do we, create the domain that a startup needs to be in? There are a few of you, and I'm sure who have very concrete ideas and what you want to do, but there seem to be still an overwhelming majority of people who seem to ask, how do I get a good idea? Right? And if that's something which you are asking, then maybe the next slide is something which you need to start thinking about. So I don't know if there is any mechanism to interact, because I do have several interactive questions which are coming up, and I'm hoping that I can actually interact with you as we go along. And if there is a way to get responses back from the students, it would be great to have that coming
Mr. Arun, we have few student coordinators here online. I think you can interact with them. And if there are any queries you would like to ask, there are also faculty coordinators. You can
All
just
right.
drop down and we can look forward the response, I believe.
All right. So if the coordinators can maybe type in the chat some of the responses that may be coming in, at least that will give me some sense of what people have in mind. So, but maybe I'll skip this one. So at least the next one certainly needs some amount of interaction. So I'll skip past this and then maybe come to the next one. So the reason for asking this question is really to figure out what is your level of comfort. Maybe you're getting good food, maybe you're having a comfortable life, you are enjoying your free time, you're having a good time with your friends. So if everything is good and comfortable, then where do you start getting your ideas from? The reason I ask that question is one needs to move away from one's comfort zone to see how ideas come up. Right? So that comfort zone that's at the bottom left there, that's the area where you normally live, where you're comfortable, where things are happy, and you don't really see anything which upsets or irritates you or gets you worked up. But you need to sort of take a step beyond that area for the startups to happen. The most powerful sources of ideas and inspiration is not necessarily others who have done wonderful things. Study and understand what other startups have done, what other founders have done, but it's really your individual sources of irritation or annoyances, right? That's where the most your secret sauce for figuring out ideas lies. If the solar panel takes too long to get you hot water, that's something which should irritate you and something which you should start thinking about. If there are long queues at the canteen for lunch, that's something which should perhaps be irritating you, and that's something which you should think about. Or if you party and your friends don't settle their share of the bill with you, then that's something which may be irritating you. These annoyances, these everyday things that you encounter are the most powerful sources of ideas. That's where the problems lie. That's where you are finding a friction in your life, and you need to start seeing how you can make things happen, how things can be changed, and how you can find a problem that needs solving. If you don't see a problem, if your life is good and great, then you may not be really encountering something which needs solving yourself. Right. So this is a story, many of you may be familiar with it, of how Airbnb started. So this is about when the founders were in San Francisco and they were staying in a room, they couldn't actually afford to pay the rent. That was a problem that they were having. So they said, maybe we can, when there was an event or conference going on in that city, they said, maybe we can rent a portion of a room to someone else. And that's how they started. And then, they got some success. They got 2 people to sign up. And that led them think that maybe there is a bigger answer to this one. It's not just our problem. Maybe the others who have very similar problems. Maybe the other similar users who need a temporary space for a day or 2, and then hotels may be too expensive. Maybe there's something else we can give them. So they started expanding upon that, and that personal problem that they had was something which led them to, create Airbnb and then become the success they are. Of course, the path was not that straightforward, that it didn't go off from that initial idea all the way to the billions of dollar valuation today. But you need that initial, that source of inspiration, and that is best from your own personal experiences of those very close to you. So the comfort zone, you need to get out of that, and hence this slide essentially captures that, and I won't spend a lot of time on this particular one. So a second source of inspiration is to do new things. Right? It's not about if you are comfortable in your life and life is great, then maybe you wonder, maybe I'm not the kind of person who can create a startup. That's not actually true. A lot of people do create startups, even though they are happy and enjoying life and so on. It's because they are open to new experiences. So whether it's a new kind of app or a new personal experience that you go through, it opens up your mind to new things beyond what you are. The more you explore, the more you open up your mind to new experiences, the more you understand in areas which may need something to be done. Maybe, as an example, and not a particularly successful example, but I personally, during the last year's lockdown, I thought, let me start learning some kind of a music. I never learned music, but the fact that I could, I got hold of some self-teaching courses. I started learning. I failed miserably, and as you can imagine, this is not the age for me to start learning music. Particularly, I was trying to see if I can play a musical instrument, and that was not very successful. But it let me experience things which otherwise I would never have done. Right? So this was actually a pretty common saying. It's been used in a lot of advertisements and so on. When was the last time you did something for the first time? So that's something which you should ask. As a youngster, I think there must be a new thing that you must be doing literally every month. But you still need to seek out new experiences and use that as your source of inspiration. So I'll skip past the next couple of them. And so this is maybe I'll go to the next one straight away. Once you from your own personal experience or from those around you, find out there is a problem, that source of annoyance or irritation or something that upsets you, and you want to start looking at that. Or you see something which is happening with someone else, and that's even more better, and that becomes your source of problem that you're trying to do. Probably the most important thing is to frame the problem correctly. If you do not frame the problem, then a lot of the subsequent things that you do in a startup can actually go haywire. This is probably the most fundamentally important thing for a startup to be successful, in defining the problem space well. A lot of startups, even those who are still around and who are actually started and running, they don't really frame the problem well, and that's where the bulk of the problem lies. So how do you go about framing the problem? So let me go through a few examples, and then this is one where I do need the coordinators to get some responses back, because these are, I need answers to about 7 different questions here. Right. So if you're okay, let me start with that. And right. So there are some 7 problem statements I'm going to be listing down here, and what I need from those participating is that a good problem statement or a bad problem statement, right? Or a poorly worded problem statement. So is that clear? So I do need that response back in order to go to the next step. So maybe you can ask around and then type back in the chat or something like that. And for those who maybe, if they're far away, cannot read, I will read out the problem statement. So let me go to the first one. Right. So this seems like a common thing which you might have seen either in a existing startup, or many times these look very similar to the college projects definitions that you would come up with, right? So this particular statement is, I want to help all farmers adopt organic, environmental friendly and sustainable farming methods. So is this a good problem statement or a poorly worded problem statement? So, I'll wait to hear from you. Any coordinators, can you at least type something in the chat to make sure that that channel is working? I don't see anything. So the answer I need is really, is this a good problem statement, as good or a poor one? So, okay, I see one called good. And all right, so let me answer this one, and maybe that will open up the topic, and we'll certainly discuss why it is a good or a bad thing at the end. So this one, I'm not sure you can read it, but this is actually a poor problem statement. So sorry about that, but it's not a trick question really. I mean, it's something which you need to understand on what constitutes a good problem statement, and we'll cover that as we go along. So let me come up with a next one and see if you have a different answer for that. While electric vehicles are cheaper to run, and electric two-wheelers will make it affordable for everyone. I know that there are quite a few projects from the automobile team around electric vehicles in PES. So what do you think about this problem statement? The problem statement here is in the context of a startup. If they start with this problem statement, would they make good progress? I'll get a couple of more seconds and see if there's a way to collect responses. All right, let me go ahead. That's a poor one as well. And let's look at another one. Accurate analysis of X-ray images to detect COVID-19 needs an expert, as the details are often unclear. There aren't enough of the experts, and hence there are a lot of pending cases. What about this? I mean, is this a good problem statement to start with, or you think this isn't? I want you to use your intuition to respond to that, not because you studied this or something like that, just purely based on your intuition. All right, so let me go ahead and so this is a particularly, I think there's someone who's raised a hand and.
So with respect to the first statement, actually what can we think is that it is a somewhat generalized statement. So with respect to the third one, it is coming accurate to the problem.
Right. No, thanks. I think that's a good analysis. There's something a little bit more specific about them, and I'll talk about that now, and maybe we can use that for the remaining four. So a good problem statement doesn't talk about the solution, right? The problem statement has to focus genuinely on what the problem is. The first one, in fact, it doesn't really talk about a problem. It says we want to solve it in this fashion by making farmers adopt sustainable or organic or something else. But why? What is the problem that they're trying to solve is not really defined there. What it talks about is a solution. Similarly, the second one, electric vehicles are cheaper to run, and it talks about what is the approach to solving some problem. Not actually, it doesn't talk about the problem. If it, on the other hand, said that the same thing could be restated as petrol or diesel vehicles are expensive, two-wheelers are expensive to run because of that, and hence that's a way of defining a problem in an appropriate way. Once you start bringing in elements of the solution into the problem, then it no longer is a good problem statement. The third one, the reason why it is a good problem statement is because it talks about the problem and not how to solve it. And we will debate this particular one a little bit more as we go along. Let's quickly go through the next few, and then you'll get a sense of this, hopefully. Milk adulteration causes harm to end users and loss to dairy product industries. New adulteration methods are difficult to detect with conventional methods. Right now, this is a good problem statement because it's describing what the problem is and not trying to solve it in the problem statement. I think that's the fundamental thing which we all need to keep in mind. Look at this, and then you'll hopefully start getting a sense of this pattern, right? Adding a G sensor to a helmet can help detect accidents and alert rescue workers and family. It's a noble thing to do, certainly, right? But is that a good problem statement? It's not, because it's describing the solution, really. So let me go through the next few. Voter turnout is poor in urban areas. Voters do not go to polling booths and instead go on vacation, use it as a holiday. Creating online polling booths will allow such voters to participate. right? So this starts off well, this problem statement, because it's describing what the problem is, but then it kind of gets muddled up because it starts describing a solution of an online polling booth, right? So, and hence, focusing on keeping the problem statement to the problem and not inserting the solution into that is necessary. So this is starting off well, but then it kind of gets muddled. So this last one here, hopefully this will resonate with many of you. I find it difficult to stop watching Netflix or doom scrolling on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, even though I know I should be doing other things. Now, this is a problem. You're not trying to tell how to solve this thing. This is a problem that's being stated. So this is a good problem statement. So what defines a good problem statement really is how well it captures the problem without trying to define a solution for that. And that's very important, because the solution to the problem could be in different domains. Right? The moment you start putting a solution into that mixture, you start anticipating how it should be done, and you're sort of not thinking about the user. You start moving into the technology a bit too early. This is probably the most important line, the problem statement that a startup should have, and helps in every aspect of the startup. Subsequently, when you want to define your product, you want to communicate what problem you're trying to solve to your users or to your investors, this is exactly the thing that you need to do. For all the other things where you start with a solution, you need to go back and explain to them what the problem you're trying to solve with. And if you're not articulated that well enough right in the beginning, then it means you're going to have a problem. So let's look at this particular one, right? The accurate analysis of X-ray images to detect COVID-19 needs an expert, as the details are often unclear. The X-rays may not always be the clearest, and there are not enough experts around who can interpret them, and hence, there's a lot of pending cases. Let's say we take that as a problem statement, and then see how you could potentially solve that as different users. So the way to do that is take a problem statement and then start looking at ideas which are divergent. You shouldn't start with a single idea as a solution space, right? You need to consider many different ideas, and hence that will allow you to find the right solution to that problem. If you start with the solution, then you're kind of prejudged what is the best solution for that without really thinking about it from a problem point of view. So let's take that the previous one that I was talking about. Accurate analysis of X-ray images, right? That particular one. And you think about it from a point of view, if you are not who you are, right? You're not an engineer. Let's say you are a student of physics or chemistry, and you get this exact same problem. How would you approach solving that? Clearly, there are other approaches to solving it than just the engineering point of view. Maybe there are different ways of creating new kinds of lenses which will focus better and extract more details. So, or even though most of the X-rays are digital today, maybe there are different kind of films using different chemistry which can allow a clearer X-ray to be taken. So that could be one way of solving that, and hence de-skill that operation, because there is so much more detail available now, and hence you can solve that problem. So that's one possible way. If I were to ask this to someone from IT or in general the electrical sciences, electronics or electrical or IT, most often the answer would be, let's do a AI or a ML based solution. Let's throw a lot of images at it, train them, and you'll start getting an answer. And as an engineer, very often you'll tend to follow that particular path. Let's throw AI and ML at the problem, but that's not necessarily the best case. So now let's consider that you are a management student, right? You're not an engineer or engineering background. You're a management student coming from some other stream. How would you potentially solve this problem? Any thoughts? Let's say X-ray. If you are a management student, how would you solve that problem? All right. So let me propose an alternative way of doing it. Because there's a shortage of experts and it needs experts to do this, Maybe a mechanism from a management student point of view would be to use economical models, right? You create a pool of experts whose only job is to do this. They don't do anything else. Right? You devote all the experts to just analyzing X-rays, and hence you can go through them quicker. You use a human resource kind of approach or economics kind of approach to make sure that adequate time is devoted. Those experts don't do anything else other than study X-rays. There could be a different way of solving the problem. Completely non-technical, but maybe it does that job. What if you are a medical student? How would you solve that problem? So again, maybe you have a different way of approaching it. Maybe you take X-rays from different angles and you come up with maybe 4 different X-rays, and maybe it will give you the right kind of information. And maybe what if you're a politician, right? It's a completely different domain. How would you solve that problem? Maybe you'll say that you can't solve it now, but if you set up enough schools for that and create training academies, you can then solve that problem. The point I'm trying to make is that if you start with your domain understanding as the principal source of input and not have a problem in a more abstract way as a pure problem, you will be preconceived on how you want to solve that. Right? And that's not a good thing, because there could be 100 different ways of solving it, and you should put yourself in all these different roles and see how would these different disciplines solve that problem. And by doing that, you may realize that maybe there's a better solution elsewhere, and hence, what it means is that the solution that you would have tried to do may have actually failed further down the line because you have no thought about something else which can be done in a different domain in a simpler way. I think that's probably the most important thing to take away from this particular thing. Arrive at the problem statement in a very well-framed manner, with focusing just the problem and not trying to introduce solution elements into that. If you look at the previous slide and see, like adding a G sensor to a helmet can help detect accidents and alert rescue workers and family. You can't really think of this from someone who is from a management background or something else, because they've kind of put the solution there. Adding a G sensor is kind of what you are already approaching, and hence it kind of makes it preconceived and makes it very difficult to look at alternatives. And maybe there are 10 different ways to rescue two-wheeler riders in case of an accident. All right. So maybe one example that I can talk about here on how the problem got framed would be Paytm. All of you are familiar with Paytm as a wallet today, but they didn't really start off as a wallet company. So they were originally a airtime recharge, and they saw the problem of recharge being done using either scratch cards. I'm not even sure many of you would be familiar with that. Scratch cards, or there used to be some coupons, airtime recharge cards where you had to scratch something and type it in and so on. So it was expensive to print those cards, and hence there was a business model which required to change, and that was the problem which Paytm started to solve, and that led to incremental changes, incremental new definitions, and led them to this wallet. So they didn't start off saying let's solve how people store money. I don't think that was really the objective. It's just that it started with a very specific problem. They were successful at that problem. They generated the reputation, the users who could then be used to build further upon. All right. What am I doing for time? Okay, I'll take on the 15 minutes or so, and then I'll move on to other things. Once you've got an idea, then you would need to arrive at a solution, thought about all the different alternatives, and then now you have narrowed down an idea and say, this looks like a good solution to the problem I originally started with. Then you need to get into a feasibility study. In many cases, as engineers, this seems the easiest part of how we need to do, but I think you need to still think a little bit further. While you look at the feasibility, you also need to know if there is a existing market for such a solution. How is that problem being solved? It's unlikely that that problem is not being addressed today. People are living with that problem, so there must be some ways to getting that done. So either as a technology or as a domain, you need to look at what stage of evolution is that in. If it is in a very early stage, you need to build a product which is very different than if it is a mature domain. Right? So those are things which you would need to understand so that you could come up with the right solution. An example would be, if you take the case of drones. Right? 6 to 8 years ago, anything that flew was considered a exciting enough drone, and it became interesting and a good enough product to make a startup. Maybe about 3-4 years ago, since you could buy literally a drone on the internet any day you wanted to, it didn't really have the same level of excitement of just getting something to fly. You need to make it do something better. You need to be packaged. You need to be simpler to use, and so on. Today, with drones being there in pretty much every domain and people trying to build on top of that, what you need is differentiation. You need your drone to be, either having better range or more functions or more flying time or whatever. So you will need to start looking at differentiating yourself from everything else. So the maturity of that domain or the technology would mean that your feasibility would need to consider that and see whether you're creating a completely new product, which means you need to educate users, or there are some players in the space you don't really see a lot of competition. Then you need to focus on how to make it simpler for people to use, and there are already quite a few players in that market. Then you just look at differentiation. What would differentiate your product from others, or maybe pick a niche use case. And even if it is declining, you can still get into that area. In fact, one of my bosses a few years ago used to talk about the most money can be made at the beginning of this curve and at the end of this curve, when there are very few players, because here not enough have entered, and here people are moving on to other things. That's where the most of the money can be made. So as a startup founder, you should certainly keep that in mind, that at both ends of the curve is where the bulk of the money needs to be made. Right. There's one source of information on where you are in the maturity curve, and that's the Gartner hype cycle. If you've not seen this, I think it's something which you should certainly give it a shot. So this is published every year, and this is the 2021 one, and this is 2017 here, when most of you guys would have got into college. So this talks about a variety of different technologies and at what stage of maturity they are on. If you're not seen this in the past, it's pretty straightforward, and this is exactly the same curve every year. It's just that different technologies get positioned on that curve. This is when things start getting talked about. There's a lot of hype that gets built up, and then, like in many cases, the hype is followed by realization that it doesn't do all the things that it's supposed to do, and then after some time, it starts becoming actually getting adopted and used. Right. So augmented reality or virtual reality, there's a lot of hype about it. Then people realize it actually doesn't do a whole lot. It kind of dipped. But now people are starting to put real world applications around it, and it's going to that. So this is the innovation trigger, the peak of inflated expectation, the trough of disillusionment, and the slope of enlightenment. The plateau of productivity is eventually when people start looking at the cost and so on. And these dots and and these diamonds represent how far away they think before it reaches this point. So some of these things, like the ones with the black dots, are 5 to 10 years away. The ones with the yellow triangles, those are more than 10 years away to reach this point. So that gives you a sense of how mature that market is. So, but this, and there are plenty of other similar sources which you can use to figure out how mature that market is and how you should think about your product. The next thing to think about is, now that you identified the problem, you have a solution. Should you do the whole solution? Right? It's often not a good idea to do the whole solution. Let's say if you are thinking about an electric vehicle, then is doing the whole electric vehicle the best way to approach that problem? Or is there a more specific problem within that electric vehicle that you think you can do better than what others are doing? Eventually, what you do has to be distinct enough, it has to be unique enough, and excuse me, and valuable enough that it's worth creating a startup for. And hence, building the whole vehicle may not be the best thing, because there's so many others who are better at doing it. It will take a long time to get there. Excuse me. A good example of this is ARM. ARM doesn't actually manufacture semiconductors, as many of you would know. What they license is IP, and everybody else uses it to build their own variant of the ARM chipsets. So they created the instruction set and the design, which they then licensed to everybody else. They could very well have tried to do the chips themselves, and then they would be competing with Intel. They would be competing with Qualcomm or everybody else. Now, each of them is a customer, and hence, ARM can focus on the real core element without worrying about the manufacturing part of it. In a very different context, there was a famous management guru who talked about core competency, that C.K. Prahalad, excuse me, that's relevant not just to the big companies that he was addressing, but to the startup as well. Pick the area in that problem space where you have the most competency, where you can make the most difference, and focus on that. Everything else is secondary. The more amount of time you devote to everything else, the less time you have to devote to your core competency. So partitioning the problem becomes an important essence of how the problem gets solved. Netflix, for example, their focus is content. I mean, as many of you would know, Netflix started by shipping DVDs via postal mail, and now they are basically the kings of streaming. But they still do DVD shipments even today, because their model is not around streaming. It's just a way of delivering content. It still is a content. How do they make content easy to consume, easy to discover? The recommendation engine is one of the best around, which helps people discover new content, which you may not have otherwise encountered. So that's where their forte is, and whether it's delivery via DVD or streaming, this just happens to be a secondary thing. I think we are about 45 minutes in, so I'll go faster through this, but these are things which I'm sure you would have encountered in many of your other sessions as well, and hence maybe it may not be worth repeating. The ring canvas model is something which I'm sure you have seen in other sessions in this. Sorry, just give me a moment. Sorry about that. Hopefully it should be okay now. So this is something which you would have seen in many other places, or it's something which is now considered the best way to think about a startup at the early stage. So this gives you all the parameters that you need to consider. And if you've got a good problem statement, a good solution, and identify the area where you really want to focus on, then putting the lean canvas together becomes a pretty straightforward thing. When you're doing this, I think a few things to keep in mind are whether you are essentially going to be what is called a B2C or a B2B. Are your end users going to be other companies, or are they going to be actual customers on the street? And that makes a huge difference, and that's something which needs to get decided pretty early on in the life cycle of a startup. Similarly, the regulatory aspects which need to be considered. If you're doing something in healthcare or payments or aviation or insurance or many of the other areas which are regulated, that means you cannot choose to do what you want to do, because there's some very stringent guidelines on how you need to do things. So those are things which you need to consider, because otherwise you could find yourself not in compliance with the laws and could put yourself in trouble. The next thing to look at while coming up with the canvas, and maybe immediately after that, is look at competition and alternatives to the solution. Clearly, the problem that you're solving has not gone unnoticed by others. Right? It's not that somehow you are uniquely the only one who has seen the problems. I'm sure others would have seen the problem, and maybe people are thinking about different ways to do it, or maybe different companies are doing exactly the same way you are thinking of doing it. Looking at them and identifying how you would differentiate is going to be important. Again, a successful startup would do this more upfront. You don't have to obsess about competition, because it's not like just because they do something, you have to do something else. but you need to be aware of what's happening so that you don't get caught, with on the wrong foot and find yourself in deep trouble. The next two slides are probably the most important ones, which we see talking about after the problem framing. This is defining a minimum viable product. And subsequently, the second one is the product market fit. They're kind of very connected to each other. What constitutes the minimum product that you should build? In that entire problem statement that you come up with, is there a simple product that you can create which will solve just one part of that problem for one set of users? And can you make that happen? If you can, then that's the minimum viable product. It may not address the entire problem. It may not address the entire set of users who you are originally thinking about. But if it can do one small thing and actually solve that problem for a small subset of people, then that would be the minimum viable product. Right. So this is a matrix which kind of defines or guides you on how you should think about dropping features. MVPs are typically about dropping features and not about adding them. So you start with a definition. I want to do this whole thing. Start chopping features because they don't really add as much value, or they are nice to have and you could do without them. And what you're left with is this first column, what's important and urgent, and focus on that. Typically, that should also bring down the cycle time because you have less features to do, you can do it quicker, it costs lesser to do, and hence you can take the feedback and have a second chance at doing something better. Once you have that definition in place and you executed it, you look at the product market fit. A lot of metrics around this, but I won't go into that. But the essence of it is that you need to talk to end users on a regular basis. If you have a MVP prototype in place, you should go and talk to your users, get feedback, and iterate. That's pretty much the essence of it. And unless you have got users who are happy with that, then you don't move on to the next one. In fact, there's one specific definition that's used in product market fit, and that's about effectively withdrawal symptoms. In case you took away your product, would there be any of your early users who would be disappointed? And if there are not enough people who say they will miss your product, then they don't really need your product. So that's the kind of thing that you need to do to ensure that the product you've come up with, the definition you've come up with, is actually usable, people want it, and in fact, people will start missing it in case you take that product away. I'll skip past the execution in the interest of time and look at funding. Funding typically, most people think about it in the context of VC funding or angel funding. When there's a talk about hundreds of millions of dollars getting raised all around us by every kind of startup, that seems to be the primary way of doing it. But there are many ways of raising funding. Friends and family is the most commonest one. You get small amounts of money, but that's all you need to get things moving. Bootstrapping is another common way where you would have some small source of revenue, enough to cover your expenses, and that will let you keep building upon using your own internal resources. You don't need external funding to get those initial incremental steps in place. Incubators like the one at PES and other universities, that is another good place. They give you the infrastructure that reduces your cost and lets you do things without necessarily needing a lot of funds. Then you have the angel investors and venture capitalists, which are sort of the classical sources of funding that everybody thinks about. Those, plenty of them are there, but the point of this slide is that there are plenty other options beyond just those two. Crowdfunding is a good example. You would have heard of Kickstarter or Indiegogo. India also has a couple of them like Crowdera and Wishberry, which are quite popular. And if you've got an idea which you don't want to make it big, but you want to start small, get a few customers, a platform like Wishberry is a great way to do that because it lets you get a few customers, also gets you some money and gets you started. And then the bank loans, and in today's world, there are a lot of government grants, particularly for specialized areas which the government is keen on. So all of these are sources of funding. So when you look at a startup, you need to consider every one of them as sources of funds for getting your startup up and running, and not just the classical angel investors or the VC funds. So in conclusion, you need to find a problem and frame that well. I think that's I'm repeating it multiple times, but that's really the essence of a successful startup. If you're able to frame the problem well, then you got everything else in the startup in place. You can communicate that to your teams, you can communicate that to end users, communicate that to investors and everybody else. It makes it easier for you to make your website because you know exactly what you are going to be doing. Then you would solve the problem in a way that actually lets you focus on a specific part of the problem. You don't have to solve the entire problem. Partition the problem in a way that lets you pick that essence where you have the competency to do that. Put yourself in a bunch of different people's shoes so that you get divergent solutions possible, and then see if the solution that you want to do, is it actually worth doing? Are there better ways of solving it using somebody else's hat, wearing somebody else's hat? Build a prototype and get the feedback. And only once you get past that the initial feedback where you're getting to have some people use it on a regular basis, then you could say that you have product market fit. And then comes funding and everything else. So the first 5 you should be able to do without really raising funding or any serious amount of funding other than your own resources. Then that's kind of where things stand. And then comes scaling and all that, which I wouldn't go to in this session. A few resources I will leave with. So in case you're interested, you could look at a couple of online sources. Captain Raghuraman's Business Lessons is an excellent source of inspiration for thinking about the people in the street and seeing how they can inspire you to better ideas. Peter Thiel's book, PayPal Founders on 0 to 1, excellent book for startups. Anything you get from the Y Combinator library is a great resource. I'm sure you can benefit a lot by going through them. And this book, if you've not heard about it, it's worth looking at. It's 24 steps to a successful startup. So very detailed and extremely elaborate book on what you need to do and what will give you a better chance of succeeding than not doing those things. So that's an excellent book as well. And those are the things I wanted to share with you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I wish we could have had more interaction and through this session, but the format doesn't let us do that. But we'll be glad to answer any questions that come up and see how we can interact. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Arun Tanksali. It was an insightful speech. So this particular webinar was supposed to take on online platform. That was the clear instructions. As a result, we were able to do this. In coming days, probably we will be looking forward to have you in our campus to
Sure.
direct talks and have interactions with departments. Now we are open for questions. If any questions or queries are there, the faculty coordinators and two student coordinators can pose it across. We have another 5-10 minutes of time. All right. Anybody who wants to pose questions can put it in the chat box, or you are feel free to ask through the mics. Yes, Ramesh. You have some question, I believe. You have raised hands.
Sir, actually, one thing I need to ask is, am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are audible.
Actually, while defining the problem statement, we need to go with the technology approach. We need to use the technology approach and other things. So there may be a chance of other can also use the same technology and come up with that things also. So it's better to tell what we are doing with respect to the problem statement, or can we hide that one and we can project as a problem statement? If that statement is not there, means I don't think that will be a more effective problem statement.
No, could you repeat that last bit a bit?
Siddesh, can you come again?
The last line, could you just repeat that?
Yeah. Suppose I want to come up with a new technology for a particular problem. In that case, do I need to include that technology in that problem statement, or can I leave that name in that problem statement? By defining the problem statement, means copyrights and other things, means someone might take that idea and again they can go on also. If we tell in the problem definition itself.
Right. Right. My general answer to that would be to not include the name of the technology in the problem statement, because you need to assess whether the technology itself is necessary to solve that problem. Maybe there are ways to do that. Eventually, you may conclude that by using the technology, you can solve it in a particular way, which gives you certain benefits, right? But you should keep in mind that there could be others who are not using that specific technology you have in mind, but solving the problem in different ways. And eventually, in the market, you would need to see how your product, using the way you are defined it, is going to compete with others who are maybe using it in different ways. So unless you put that thinking hat and look at how others might be doing it, you might sort of fool yourself into thinking that it works well, because you kind of presuppose that need for the technology. So I would say that including the name of the technology or how you want to achieve it in the problem statement is not necessarily a good idea. But it should obviously become necessary as soon as you get to the next stage, where you start looking at how you will solve that, and so on.
Thank you, sir.
Any more queries, questions? Anybody would like to ask any questions? Well, I believe we are done for the day, Mr. Arun. Well, it's time for proposing vote of thanks. I thank Mr. Arun Tanksali, who was able to provide a very insightful speech through the webinar on building successful startups. He was able to just enlighten us on how to avoid pitfalls while setting up new startups, and how to define the problem and find solution to it. He also provided various insights on how to come up with divergent ideas and consider various different alternatives. Along with that, he was also able to propose a feasibility study, how to go about it, and partitioning the problem, how to actually break the problems and kind of it, and how to cope up with the competition when you're on building a startup as such, and how to come up with a minimum viable product, and what could be the possible sources of funding for getting up a startup to go on, right? I believe everybody would have made use of it. I think somebody has raised hand. Yeah, Ulas. Sure, sure, sure. Yeah,
Please
yeah,
go.
please.
How to understand the level before you go for funding, or what kind of funding you need. Is that right? All right. I think the means to figuring that out is using the lean canvas, that method I was talking about. So once you identified how you want to approach the solution, you would need to see how long it's going to take for you to put together a solution, how many iterations you think are going to be needed before you get a solution that's workable. And that starts giving you a sense of what is the cost that you would need to incur. I mean, eventually it boils down to a simple math. You have certain costs that you want to incur. You have your internal resources that will allow you to do portion of that, and then you have a gap which needs to get funded by other sources. If the gap is moderate, then you could use crowdfunding or family and friends, and manage with that. But if the gap is large, that's when you would necessarily need to go to a formal investor. And you could also consider the government grant if your project is in a domain which is socially relevant, and hence you could start considering that. But basically, it boils down to using the lean canvas to decide what are the different areas that you need to focus on. What are the costs for achieving that MVP and a product market fit, and then get to the gap between what you have and what you need. And that's really the end of it. Actually, I tend to agree with the person you were talking to yesterday. Focusing on the product is certainly a much better way to use one's time in engineering college. A startup comes with, it's a legal entity eventually. It comes with certain amount of responsibilities, whether towards other members of the startup or towards the government, because you need to now start filing documents and stuff like that, which is taking away time from what you could do in improving the product. So focusing on the product while at a incubation center in the engineering college is certainly a much better use of the time. It will let you focus on the real thing that you should be doing. And once you get some kind of a that viable product in place where you have something which you think the industry term is where you think it has legs, then you start converting into a more formal arrangement. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. So that's a in a very specific context. First, that was a very impressive product that I heard about. So I think the context in which I was explaining to him was that as a student product, someone whose business depends upon CNC machine will not take a risk with this if this is their only CNC machine or one or two that they have. So clearly, it makes sense to go to someone whose primary business is not around CNC machine, and hence this becomes a nice experiment to do where they don't mind in case there's some issue which will always be there in any new product. So going to someone whose secondary business is around this particular product would be the appropriate thing to do. Now, coming to the specific question of to do it in the name of the college or as an independent startup, I think to figure out that there is someone willing to pay is probably the very first step. And that can be done even in the name of the college, right? Because if there is someone willing to pay, then the actual conversion of that into commercial order and things like that can always happen in many different ways. But going out and reaching other institutions and talking to them in the name of the college gives you better credibility and also will allow you to do that without taking the risk of starting up a full company too early. So it does make sense to give, go as a part of the college to other institutions. I'm sure it will give a lot more credibility to the product as well. Right. Right. No, I think in general it is possible. Specifically, of course, it would need to be compliant with your college's accounting policies and so on. But in general, it is perfectly doable. I don't see a problem with that. Sure. Yeah. Right. So first, while hiring such a employees, and as you said, you would need to have a team of some kind at some point, and it's not like you can do everything with just one or two people. You would need a team of engineers and others to start working on it. I think the most important thing in hiring for startups is cultural fit. That's something which you may have encountered earlier. That people who would like to work in startups come with a very different mindset than those who would like to work at a more established company. So finding the cultural fit, who are excited about doing things, who are excited about learning new things, that is something which is absolutely important. Making it very apparent at the beginning that they are going to be working in a startup and the atmosphere, environment is going to be very different is going to be fundamental. Second, from a more on a material point of view, startups are the ones which invariably have schemes like ESOPs and so on, so that if the startup succeeds, the employees do get the benefit from that. And most of these are tied to continuity of employment. So if they leave, then they kind of they lapse those ESOPs and so on. So ESOPs are a very good tool to encourage employees to not just see this as a employment, but as they are a part of their company in a more fundamental way. They are the full stakeholders, not just stakeholders, shareholders as well. And that's a good way to do that. Most startups do use ESOPs as a tool for retaining employees.
Well, anybody else to raise questions? Yeah, Chetan, you have some question, Chetan Kumar. Chetan, you can ask question. You can unmute and talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Chetan from Computer Science Department. So my question is, when would be the best time to go for the VCs? Whether you have to go after you have a prototype, or can we try going for a VC before having a prototype? Or probably if you have data and market analysis which has already been done, and if you don't have a prototype, still we can approach VCs, or we have to have a complete prototype and then go to a VC.
Well, my view, and I'm not sure others in the startup board would agree with this, is to approach VCs as late as possible. Right. So if you can do without approaching VCs, that's great. I mean, you don't have to. It's not necessarily a milestone in every startup journey. There are startups today which have never had a VC funding them, and they're doing quite well. Zerodha is a big example in the investment space today. So a VC is not necessarily a milestone which has to be reached by everybody. So in fact, if you can avoid getting the VC to a later point, the better it is. What happens when you go and raise investment from a VC is that you need to give a stake in the company to them. The earlier you give a stake in the company, the more the stake you would be parting with them, which makes it more and more constrained for you to bring in other investors in the future when you genuinely need the money. Let's say you go to a VC at the end of, let's say, first year, you don't really have any revenue coming in, so all you have is an idea, maybe a prototype, or maybe not even that, and clearly no revenue. So if you go and talk to a VC, they'll say, okay, we'll put some small amount of money, but I need a big chunk of your company to be given to us. Now, what it does is that you'll get that money, you build something, and when you go, let's say a year later, when you want to raise more money to scale up or something, you'll find that your portion of the company is already reduced. So the next guy you do something more, then you will end up in a few years in a very small minority. It's not a bad thing. It's just that there's something which you need to be aware of, and hence deferring a VC investment till the point where you genuinely need one is probably the way to do it. So it's not about how soon you can approach; it's how late you can hold on from approaching. That's my view. Then.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arun Tanksali. Any more questions? Any more queries? Well, it was insightful question and answering sessions over here, and I think we were able to take away a lot of insights from this particular webinar. So we were at the end of our vote of thanks. So I wholeheartedly thank Mr. Arun Tanksali for making his time in spite of his busy schedule and coming over and giving an webinar to all of us. Right, I wholeheartedly thank on behalf of the management, principal, teaching and non-teaching fraternity. Thank you one and all. We will be concluding the session for now. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Arun Tanksali. Good day.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your patient listening this afternoon. Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye then.